Should the new Constitution be ratified by the state legislatures or directly by the people? We must be very careful to answer that question appropriately, because the success or failure of the new government may depend on it. The most fundamental principle of free government is that the people retain all power which they have not freely turned over to the government. Have the people given their state governments the right to ratify the new Constitution? I don't believe any state constitution includes that power, and I know for sure that many of them do not. Even if a state did have such a provision in its constitution, there would still be a couple of big problems with having the states ratify the Constitution. For one thing, if a state ratifies today, it may change its mind later. For another, some people don't consider their state constitution to be legitimate because it was not derived from the clear and undisputed authority of the people. Virginia, for example, we can't afford to have the new national government built on such a shaky foundation.
The idea that a state legislature might rescind a previous ratification is nonsense. Once they decide to ratify, it's a done deal. But this whole idea that the state legislatures are not authorized to make a decision on ratification is a more serious matter. That way of thinking did not exist when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. No one thought it was necessary to have express powers granted to the state government, because we all considered the state legislatures to be legitimate representatives of the will of the people in their respective states, whether it specifically spelled out each power in their constitution or not. It was the states that ratified the Articles of Confederation, and I haven't heard any complaints about that. When the national government needed more authority, who did it turn to? The people? No, it looked to the state legislatures. And frankly, we have a better chance of getting the Constitution ratified if we stay with that, because the eastern states are primarily concerned with getting rid of the public debt. They aren't going to be thrilled with a more powerful national government because they will equate that with more public debt.
Even if some state constitutions do include the express power to decide in matters of changes to the Articles of Confederation, the simple fact that some do not is sufficient reason to place ratification in the hands of the people. But a more compelling reason is that the Constitution is going to require significant changes in the state constitutions, and that means the state legislatures have a major conflict of interest in the matter of ratification. And I would like to point out that a constitution is a contract that can only be made with the people. The Articles of Confederation, therefore, is not so much a constitution as a treaty. There are some important implications of that distinction. For example, if a treaty is in conflict with a pre-existing law, that former law is sometimes upheld in the courts. But if a law conflicts with a constitution, that law is always null and void. Period. Another implication is that violation of any part of a treaty by any party to it renders, under international law, the entire treaty unenforceable. Not so with a constitution.
Election of the president will be considered an extremely serious matter. If we agree to this motion, we'll have to limit the president to one term in order to preserve his independence from the legislative branch, and I don't like that idea at all.
I don't think it would be necessary to limit him to one term. By the time he is up for re-election, there will be new faces in Congress, so he will not be dependent for re-election on the same members who elected him the first time. Also, we need to be careful that we don't make the new government too complex. We need to keep it as simple as possible.
Why not stick to what we talked about earlier, a 7-year term, and no re-election? But I don't want a single executive, because that's too much power in the hands of one man. I prefer dividing the states into 3 sections, each choosing an executive. That way the different needs and interests of the northern and southern states will be protected. If we can nail down the ineligibility for re-election, I could go for a longer term, maybe 10 or 12 years.
I move to reinstate ineligibility for re-election.
Second.
I don't see that having the executive elected by the legislature necessarily requires him to be ineligible for re-election. If he's doing a good job, why not let him continue doing a good job? And he's more likely to do a good job if he knows he's not necessarily going to be turned out of office no matter how well he performs. Plus, the possibility of re-election will help attract the best candidates to the position.
How long the executive serves is not that important, just as long as he's doing a good job. What's more important is how he gets elected, and I regret that we've decided on putting that in the hands of Congress. That's what makes this such a difficult issue, and I'd agree to just about any term if we could just get rid of that provision.
There are problems with every possible method of electing the executive. The choices boil down to these. He is elected by some existing authority under either the national constitution or state constitutions, or by the people themselves, or by some special authority derived from the people. The only two possibilities under the national constitution are the legislature or the judiciary. No one considers the judiciary a practical option. The legislative option is so problematic that I think we should forget about it. That brings us to having the people choose electors, who, representing the will of the people, choose the executive. That option avoids a lot of problems, and it's a heck of a lot better than the legislative option, but it's already been voted down so many times by such huge margins that it's pretty clear it's not going to happen. So we're left with electing the executive by the people directly, or as many as are qualified to vote. It's not perfect, but it's the best available option. We've already talked about all the problems associated with it, and there's no need to repeat all that now. But let me just briefly mention a couple of things. One is the fear that people will prefer someone from their own state, which means the executive will most likely consistently be from a large state, and this will put the smaller states at a disadvantage. I certainly concede that point, but I would just say that, as big a problem as it may seem to be, this method is still better than the other options. And I think that if we put our heads together on this, we should be able to find some sort of fix for that. The second point is that, since there are a lot more qualified voters in the northern states than in the southern states, that puts the South at a distinct disadvantage. But that will correct itself over time as population in the South increases, and as that region adopts laws more responsive to the needs of its people. Furthermore, we must be willing to put the needs of the country as a whole ahead of local interests. I am one Southerner who is willing to do that.
I don't see how we could possibly improve on this clause. It would be almost impossible to come up with a fair rule of qualifications that's the same in every state. And we don't want a situation where a person is allowed to vote for a state representative, but not a national representative.
The situation you describe would not be unusual, and it wouldn't be a big deal. People in several states are used to different requirements for different types of elections. Furthermore, this clause makes the national legislature too dependent on the will of the states. That's not a good idea.
The right to vote is a very touchy subject in most states. People aren't going to care much for a constitution that threatens their voting rights. The states are in the best position to judge who should be able to vote and who shouldn't.
Our freedom is safest in the hands of property owners. We can't leave liberty in the hands of the multitudes without property or principle. It might be unpopular with them, but that's not important because most people in this country are property holders, and they will love the idea of restricting voting rights to property owners. Eventually, all states will do it that way.
Shouldn't every man who pays taxes have a voice in selecting the representatives who take his tax money and spend it? Shouldn't wealthy businessmen and manufacturers who pay their full share of the taxes be able to vote for the representatives who impose those taxes? Taxation and representation should stay together.
One of the biggest problems I have with the Constitution as it is now written is that it threatens the country with an aristocracy. If we give the vote to a non-property owner, he will simply sell it to a rich man. You may not see it now, but before long we will have a vast number of hourly wage earners. Can we trust such people to guard our liberty and hold the aristocracy in check? Don't be fooled by the words, taxation and representation. We don't let children vote, do we? Of course not, because they aren't mature enough to handle that kind of responsibility. Neither are many adults. 90% of the population now are property owners, so don't worry about losing the support of the other 10%. As for the wealthy, let them buy property if they want to vote. If they aren't willing to do that, They don't deserve the right to vote.
We're still a little too British. Just because land ownership was a requirement in England, we assume that's the right thing for us as well. It is not. Every responsible citizen participating in our society should be able to share in our rights and privileges. Why shouldn't merchants, the wealthy, and families with obvious strong roots in our society be able to participate in the political process?
The right to vote is certainly a fundamental element of Republican government, and it should not be left up to the states. Gradually eroding this right is historically how aristocracies are built, and we must not allow that to happen here. It's probably true that our liberty would be more secure in the hands of property owners, but it's not that simple. We should keep in mind that at some point in the future, the majority of Americans won't own land or any other property for that matter. Then what will happen? Those people may form political alliances, which could be dangerous. Or, more likely, they would simply become pawns of the wealthy and ambitious. So, it's a tough problem, and we can't ignore the political fallout of taking away voting rights for the people in some states who now have that right.
Let's not underestimate the character of the common men. For example, look at their tremendous contributions in the Revolutionary War. Look at all the seamen captured by the British who bravely chose to serve time in prison rather than work for the British Navy. In contrast, British sailors typically don't hesitate to turn against their own country. How do we explain such a marked difference in patriotism and character? It's because of the way the common man is treated in the two countries. In any case, elected officials have no right to limit voting rights arbitrarily. That's what happens in England, and how is that working out for them? The clause, as it stands now, will cause tremendous problems, especially in the larger states. How do you think the sons of a successful farmer will feel if they cannot vote simply because they themselves don't own any land? They will not be happy, and neither will a lot of other citizens.
Of all the problems with the Constitution, my biggest objection is how elections are handled. Take, for example, Senate elections in my home state of Virginia. People in cities can pool their votes in favor of a particular candidate, and they will always prevail over the combined votes of people in the country, because the rural vote is spread out among several candidates. It isn't fair, and we often end up with the worst possible candidate.
Restricting voting rights to landowners is a very bad idea. It will cause people to turn against each other, and it will alienate the disenfranchised.
I'm a bit confused here. I expected the committee to figure out exactly what the appropriate definition of property ownership is. I'm disappointed that they failed to do their job in this regard. I'm against aristocracy just as much as the next guy, but it's essential for members of Congress, the president, and judges to own sufficient land to assure their respectability and independence. If I had been on the committee, I probably would have said at least $100,000 for the president, $50,000 for each judge, and some proportionate amount for each member of Congress. Something like that.
That sounds about right. The reason we didn't come up with specific numbers in the committee is that we couldn't agree on any appropriate amounts. If we set them too high, the people will be upset. If we set them too low, they will be meaningless.
That's why it's impossible to have uniform, fixed qualifications. What works for the southern states won't be appropriate for the eastern states. What may work now will not be appropriate in the future. So, it's better to leave this matter up to the discretion of Congress than try to deal with it in the Constitution.
I don't like anything that tends to debase the spirit of the common people. We tend to equate honesty with wealth, and temptation with poverty. But some of the richest guys I've known have also been the biggest crooks. We should keep in mind that this Constitution is going to be read throughout Europe as well as here at home. If we show in it a bias in favor of wealth, that will discredit us in the eyes of the most enlightened men in Europe, and it will discourage common people from coming here.
Gentlemen, I don't think 4 years is long enough before someone can be eligible for a Senate seat. We should change that to 14, because we don't want a bunch of strangers running our country.
Nonsense! We want to encourage honorable men from other countries to come here.
Mr. Morris is right. After all, the Senate has the power to manage our foreign affairs, including treaties. It would be dangerous to put that kind of power into the hands of men with foreign interests at heart.
I agree. In fact, I'm tempted to suggest restricting Senate eligibility to men born in America. The only reason I don't think that's a good idea is because a lot of the guys who fought bravely in our revolution weren't born here.
I'm not opposed to some sort of restrictions, but I don't support Mr. Morris' proposal. We're giving Congress the power to regulate naturalization, so let them take care of this sort of thing. It doesn't belong in the Constitution.
We definitely need a long citizenship requirement, because foreigners often have dangerous ideas about how government should operate. I myself wouldn't have been a good candidate for the Senate during my early years in this country. I still had a lot of crazy notions back then, and I needed time to get Americanized.
I'm not opposed to a reasonable waiting period, but let's not get carried away. We have a lot of friends in Europe, even in England, including both houses of Parliament.
I don't doubt that there are potential problems with immigrants, but 14 years is too long. I could go for 7 max.
I can tell you from personal experience that being barred from public service is a terrible feeling. In my home state of Maryland, I was ineligible for certain jobs because of residence requirements. I didn't want any of those jobs, but knowing I wasn't eligible really got under my skin.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your input on this matter. My point is that we need to use common sense here. We certainly want to be friendly with people who come here from other countries, but friendship has practical limits. I mean, I might invite someone to stay in my home for a while, feed him well, and do everything in my power to make him comfortable. But I sure as heck wouldn't let him sleep with my wife. Likewise, I don't want these so-called citizens of the world serving in our government. I don't trust them that much.
August 21st and 22nd, the Draft Constitution, Article 7, Section 4. No tax or duty shall be laid by the legislature on articles exported from any state, nor on the migration or importation of such persons as the several states shall think proper to admit, nor shall such migration or importation be prohibited.
I object to this provision. It is inconsistent with the principles we fought for in the Revolution, and it brings dishonor to the country's character.
I don't think this provision will encourage the importation of slaves. Let's face it, the real question is whether we can get the southern states to join the Union.
I say leave this provision as is, and leave the issue of slavery up to the states. The Articles of Confederation didn't get involved with slavery, and there's no reason for us to start now. The states are in a better position to decide what's best for them, and whatever is best for each state is also in the best interest of the Union.
Look, South Carolina will never accept the Constitution if it prohibits slavery. Just leave that state alone, and it will eventually come around on its own, just like other states have done.
I don't like slavery, but our primary goal here is to come up with a constitution that we can agree on. There's really no need to deal with this controversial issue right now. Slavery is already being abolished by the states, and they'll eventually finish the job on their own. Now let's move on to the next topic.
This isn't just about the importing states. It affects all of us. Slavery brings out the worst in us, and no social good can come from it. We are asking the states to give up many of their rights. And there is no reason why the federal government shouldn't have the power to prevent an increase in slavery as well.
I've never owned a slave, so I can't speak to the effects of slavery on one's character, but let me ask you this. If we are going to approach this subject as a matter of morality, then can we just prevent an increase in slavery? Don't we also have an obligation to stop the slavery that already exists? Better to not open up that whole can of worms and just let slavery die of natural causes. Pretty soon we'll have so many poor workers that slavery will be useless, and it will go away on its own.
Whether slavery is good or bad, the fact is that it exists all over the world, and throughout history about half the population has been slaves. In any case, just leave the southern states alone, and they will no doubt stop importing slaves all on their own. Heck, as a citizen of South Carolina, I'd vote to do that now. But if we try to press the issue right now, we run the risk of serious opposition to the Constitution.
There's no doubt in my mind that even if every single one of us signs the Constitution and uses all his influence, we still will not be able to persuade South Carolina and Georgia to sign on if we try to take away their right to slavery. Those states simply cannot survive without slaves. Virginia would actually be better off if they stopped importing slaves, because they already have too many, and their value would increase. But it would be unfair to force that on South Carolina and Georgia. Besides, Generally speaking, the more slaves, the more produce, the more shipping business, the more products people buy, the more money for the federal treasury, and the better for the whole country. Personally, I don't have a problem with imposing a tax on imported slaves just like everything else, but it is guaranteed that if we take out this clause, we lose South Carolina and Georgia, no ifs, ands, or buts.
I thought we were here to discuss national issues, not state issues like slavery. Georgia has made up its mind on that topic. They have always been very skeptical of a stronger national government because they see it as a power grab by the central states who want to cut it out of the loop. Taking out this clause plays right into their worst fears. Like others have said, leave Georgia alone and the slavery issue will work itself out soon enough.
I don't think we should be involved in the slavery issue at the national level. As long as we don't do anything to encourage it, leave it alone.
I beg to differ. It is very much the business of the national government, and we need to consider whether this clause is in the best interest of the whole country or not. Authorizing the importation of slaves goes against everything we stand for and believe in. And I can't believe that issue alone would stop the southern states from ratifying the Constitution. I mean, it's not like we're going to rush right down there and enforce abolition immediately.
If we take out this clause, there's no way the southern states will become part of the Union. We can't shove our opinion down their throat, and there's really no reason to even try.
I feel very strongly that we have to give the national government the right to prohibit importing slaves. We can't afford to leave it up to the states, because chances are they will just keep right on importing slaves as long as we let them get by with it.
Anyone who thinks North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia will accept the Constitution unless it protects their right to import slaves is out of their mind. The people of those states aren't that foolish.
There are parts of this Constitution I'm not exactly thrilled with. But as I have grown older, I have come to see the wisdom of relying more on the judgment of others and believing less in my own infallibility. So I will sign this document with all its faults, if there are any, because this country needs it. If it is well administered, we will be fine, even if it isn't perfect. When you think about all the conflicting opinions, prejudices, passions, and local interests represented in this group, it's astonishing that we were able to come up with something this good. And no one will be more astonished than our enemies. So, I'm proud to sign it, because it's the best we could do, and probably the best anyone else could have done. I hope we will all sign it, and unanimously recommend it to the people, for the sake of ourselves and our posterity. And, assuming it is ratified, let's focus on making sure we do a good job of putting it into practice. I know some still have objections, but I hope they will join me in not believing too strongly in one's own infallibility. I suggest the following wording, done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present the 17th of September. In witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names.
That wording had actually been written by Gouverneur Morris, hoping it would encourage dissenting members to sign, but he felt it had a better chance of success if presented by Dr. Franklin.
Sorry guys, I know we all want to get home, and I know we've already gone over and over this, but I really think we're making a big mistake if we don't change the part that says, the number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 40,000 to read 30,000. It wouldn't be an absolute rule, but it would give Congress a little more flexibility, and it would probably help avoid objections to the Constitution.
I second that motion.
Sounds good to me.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's been bugging me too. So far, I've kept my mouth shut in these discussions, and maybe I should keep quiet now too, but this is really important, and I think we should make this change. Like Mr. Gorham says, we want as few objections as possible, and this would remove a potential problem.
There were no objections, and it was agreed to unanimously.
In response to Dr. Franklin, I'm sorry to say I cannot in good conscience sign the document, but that doesn't mean I'll oppose it back home. I just want to keep all my options open.
I have reservations about this document too, but I will sign it, because I think it's the best we could do. The majority approves of it, and that's good enough for me. So, the question for the people is, will we have a national government or anarchy? By the way, I think it's important to emphasize that the wording suggested by Dr. Franklin says that it is agreed to unanimously by all the states present, not by all the delegates present.
Might I suggest we sign the letter accompanying the Constitution to Congress, rather than the document itself? It would serve the same purpose, but it may be more satisfactory to certain delegates. Personally, I think it's the best that could be hoped for, and I have no problem putting my name on it.
I too hope we will all sign. If we don't, it might help fan the flames of discontent with the document, and we can't afford that. You're all very well aware that I have a lot of problems with it, but we have to realize that it's a choice between this Constitution and total anarchy. It's a no-brainer.
Well, I said I wouldn't sign it, but since signing only means I'm acknowledging that it is unanimously approved by the states present, I guess I will sign it after all. Doesn't mean I support it.
I'm afraid Mr. Randolph is under the impression I was referring to him in my earlier remarks. Please understand that when I was preparing those comments I didn't know if anyone in particular would refuse to sign. I might add that we are all obliged to Mr. Randolph for his many important contributions to the convention, and I still hold out hope that he may find it in his heart to join with us in signing.
It doesn't make any difference whether we sign the letter or the document itself, and Dr. Franklin's wording doesn't change anything for me. I know this might turn out to be the worst decision of my life, but my mind is made up. Has it occurred to any of you that by taking a heavy-handed, take-it-or-leave-it approach, we may be helping to produce the very anarchy you are afraid will result if the document is not approved?
Refusing to sign is not something I take lightly, and frankly it is very disturbing. But you need to understand that we have a very bad situation in Massachusetts. If we don't approach the ratification issue very delicately, we could very well end up with a civil war on our hands. By the way, Dr. Franklin, of course your remarks were directed at me and the others who refused to sign. Who do you think you're kidding?
You know, I've been staring at the painting behind the president's chair throughout the convention, trying to figure out if the artist intended a rising sun or setting sun. Finally, I know for sure. The sun is rising.